Welcome to today's lesson. Today, we will be looking at an introduction to Unit 3. And the topic that we are starting this week is we're looking at major human activities that affect environmental quality. So our unit objectives, I'll just run through these quickly with you. As usual, you know this would also be available on the e-classroom at the top of the lesson block. So upon completion of this unit, students will be able to identify which driving forces create environmental and health pressures. Of course, we had already started looking at driving forces in our previous lesson. And again, the whole concept of drivers or driving forces are not unfamiliar to you. You would also be able to understand the importance of freshwater resources, discuss agricultural development and environmental changes, understand how the improved prospects that are provided and available through industrialization, what the adverse effects and consequences of those same advances and benefits can produce. And also you would be able to discuss, excuse me, the dependence on energy and the polluting effects of that dependence. So what activities can you expect for this unit? So this unit will span 2 weeks. This is week 5 of the semester for us. So this week, there will be no activity this week. You all actually currently have an assignment that will span 2 weeks. So I don't want to overwhelm you all with too much at this point. The following week, when we continue this lesson, there will be a discussion forum activity. And week 7, when we begin unit 4, both units 3 and 4 will be assessed together in the form of a review quiz. So that's what you can expect over the course of the next few weeks. All right. So let's look at an overview of the content. So remember, the expectation is this lecture gives us a summary of the content, and additional material will be provided for you on the e-classroom page for you to do some reading and additional research so that you all can get specifics to, to fill in those details and the gaps for you. Okay, right, so we're looking at the overview. Now, the atmosphere, fertile soils, freshwater resources, the oceans, and our ecosystems that they support, or that all of those support, they play a key role in providing humans with the essential things that we need for life: shelter, food, safe water, and also the capacity to recycle most waste. So the natural processes, what we're saying is, we know that there is a capacity to recycle most waste, and typically waste that come from the natural environment and are not too highly processed. The natural processes has the capacity to recycle those natural wastes. However, the pressures exerted by the driving forces, those driving forces that you're already aware of, are in many instances increasing. So those driving forces now, such as population growth and urbanization, that's a big one. That is one of those ever increasing driving forces that adds additional pressure to our environment. So consequently, what do we find happening? We find increasing air pollution, deforestation, land degradation, deterioration of our water quality, increasing biodiversity loss, and all of these things are continuing to happen and have been happening for quite a long time. So much of the problem lies with the tendency of humans to exploit our natural resources with little or no regard to the waste that are produced or to the effect of such exploitation on our local and global systems. So for a long time, it may have been a major contributor, may have been lack of understanding as well of natural systems and the far-reaching effects that our human actions can take on the environment, and not understanding that interconnectivity between human beings, our behaviors and activity, and how it impacts our natural environment. And at the same time, what we are now beginning to understand with increasing science and information being provided back to us is that there is a significant feedback to our human health. Okay, so there is an intricate connectivity going on here, and science is only now beginning to understand that. So much waste created through our conversion of raw materials into products doesn't enter our natural cycle, because much of it is so synthesized and artificial now. It doesn't easily and naturally break down. So much of the time you find it will just sit there in the environment and does not really enter the natural cycle, which when you look at the natural cycle, as mentioned in one of the previous slides, the natural processes actually has a way of assisting in the breakdown of waste. But now with the increase in industrialization and creation of a lot of these synthetic products, now we have a problem. And what it does now, it contributes to increasing degradation and pollution of our environment. So while such resource use has formed the basis of socioeconomic development, so for example, all of that is contributing to, higher standards of living, greater comfort, in all kinds of different manifestations. We find that it has affected the quality of life in terms of how it affects the environment, and again, that feedback loop to us. So let me just go through this point again. So while such resource use has formed the basis of socioeconomic development and has enabled a part of the global population to benefit from a higher quality of life, note here, a part, the remaining much larger and more rapidly growing population of the global proportion of the global population must often overexploit what are frequently already very impoverished natural resources in order to satisfy minimum needs. So what we have happening here now is we have a great disparity taking place now, even with this industrialization, where some populations, like our affluent countries and societies, having a better quality of life, while for others it's actually getting worse, because as our environment is degraded and then the population continues to grow, we have an even greater demand on an environment that is actually producing less. All right, so the activities of poor and rich alike are actually compromising the quality of life for future generations. So we see where we're going with this, why the whole idea of sustainable development is becoming even more and more important now. So we want to look at a summary of some of these major human activities that are affecting environmental quality. The activities have been organized into blocks with various important points for you. So we're going to discuss these in turn. So we'll start with household waste, right? So even with household waste, we find that we have a lot of gaseous waste, resulting from heating and cooking in a lot of poor countries. For example, you find that they use a lot of wood and coal for energy, right? For heating and cooking, as mentioned. And what happens is, as we should already know, that this produces a lot of indoor as well as outdoor pollution. We from household waste as well. We have liquid waste. This is a byproduct of all your different types of domestic activities, from your gray water, from washing, from water, wastewater, from sewage, and all these different things. And when they are not properly treated, or where there is no proper waste management system in place, we know this can cause damage when it's released into our aquatic environment, and it will affect our water resources. Okay. Household waste. We also have significant amounts of inappropriate waste disposal that poses a serious threat to both the aquatic and the soils, the environment of our soils. So where you don't have proper waste management systems for storage, collection, and treatment, you find this would be an even greater risk. And this in particular is a very serious problem where you have growing populations and increasing urbanization, particularly in poor countries. You find the problem is exacerbated in those areas, because remember, where you have populations, you will have waste. So where you have increasing population growth and increasing urbanization, you have an increase in waste problem. Let's go to sanitation. So point one, poor household sanitation, such as lack of toilets or adequate latrines, result in excreta not being properly treated and disposed. So in many parts of the world, you actually find where you have poor populations that actually they don't have indoor toilets, they don't even have proper latrines. In some parts of the world, people uh, defecate in the open near and in water courses, and what we find is that this results in the contamination of your water resources, which in turn would be used for the irrigation of crops. So they're irrigating their crops and their agriculture with contaminated water. And what happens? You will have waterborne diseases, some common waterborne diseases that could result with cholera, diarrhea, dysentery, hepatitis A, and so on. And when you read, you find that a lot of these types of diseases are diseases you would often find in very poor countries and communities. All right. So improved sanitation can reduce these kinds of diseases and also incidents of malnutrition, because where you have these diseases now, you really mess with the health of the people, and in particular children. And remember, malnutrition has more to do with not lack of sufficient food, but poor quality food. All right. And so poor quality food will fall into this category, such as contaminated food. And also, where you have improved sanitation, it's also a potential for the recovery of your water resources, which means then that if your water resources are not being contaminated, it means that you have greater water resources and safe water sources available for you. Let's look at solid waste. So high levels of municipal solid waste, we know, is directly associated with increasing population growth and your rural to urban migration, where we have many parts of the world, and in particular, we find a significant percentage of developing countries where you have large numbers of the total population living in urban areas. And as mentioned before, where you have more people, you will always have more waste. Globalization has also resulted in industrial and hazardous waste problems. So where we have increasing industrialization, the production of hazardous waste, we find, of course, there is an increased threat to the environment and to the health of persons. Additionally, this globalization has also promoted concerns where we have transboundary transportation of hazardous waste from one country to the next, and the environmental and health risks associated with that. So a point like this, um, we would want to refer and discuss the Basel Convention where that is concerned. So remember, even as we discuss these points, um, and as you read and you do your assignments, my expectation is that you would develop on these points and extrapolate to all the various bits of understanding and information that you would have had from other courses and pull them together as is relevant. Okay, so then next point, solid waste collection. It is also a public health priority. So when you're looking at public health, you must be concerned with solid waste and what solid waste management systems you have in place. Because where there is poor solid waste management, you have all kinds of problems that can result. Um, Not only solid waste problems in terms of pollution of your land, we're looking at the next point here, the pollution of your land and freshwater, potential freshwater and seawater pollution, but the potential for air pollution and its effects on its contribution to climate change. But we also have problems with vector-borne diseases as well. Um, so these are of serious concerns when we're talking about solid waste. So what solid waste management system do they have in place? Do they have proper systems in place for storage? Do they have proper systems in place for collection and transportation of that waste? What systems do they have in place for the treatment of that waste? Okay, so again, you need here to pull information from your other courses, such as solid waste management, into issues like this. Now let's look at our freshwater resources. So demand for water, we know, is increasing. All right. We have other drivers such as domestic needs, agriculture, industry, and again, we know a lot of these are also being fueled for or driven by increasing population growth and industrialization. So we find a significant amount of water is actually being used by these sectors. Water scarcity will be exacerbated as rapidly growing urban areas place heavy pressure on neighboring water resources. So as the need for water increases, um, sectors and industries have to search out other sources of water. So there is surface water, that we know there is groundwater resources. And one of the things that can really result from this, where it can affect not only the immediate needs of the area in which the water resources are, but sometimes another thing that you have to consider is the fact that sometimes water resources serve, depending on the scale of the resource, it can serve many communities and sometimes even different countries. For example, when we look at the Nile River, the headwaters start in southern part of Africa, and it ends in the coastal areas of Egypt, right? And it runs through many countries, and many of those countries depend on the waters of the Nile. So what happens now is we have a lot of international tension going on there, where if somebody in the upper levels of that river, if they decide to put a dam or redirect the water, it affects those downstream. And there's a long history of international tension where these things are concerned. So you can read about this. You can just Google, do a search, and you'll be able to read about some of the tensions associated with that type of situation. There are other parts of the world where you have rivers that span many countries as well, and you will see the same thing happens. So you have other problems associated there. Then we have climate change and bioenergy demands. We have climate change affecting the availability of water. We know in some countries they would be experiencing flooding with the changing of the weather and seasons and weather patterns. So associated with flooding, but we know flooding doesn't necessarily mean more water availability, because associated with flooding we often have contamination of water supplies. And then we have, on the other side, we have many countries experiencing drought. So we have water scarcity occurring in that sense. Then also associated with water scarcity, when we look at the demands of bioenergy, where they're looking at agriculture to provide the fuel for energy, and we already know that agriculture has a significant demand upon water supplies. So scarcity, as mentioned, water scarcity, as mentioned before, can also be caused by pollution of your fresh water from many different sources. Because again, when we talk about water scarcity is not merely associated with the volume of water supplies available to you, but you want to consider, is it safe water supplies? So industrialization is central to economic development and improved prospects for human well-being. So there are some good things that have been noted associated with industrialization. However, if proper abatement technologies is not used, industry becomes a major source of air and water pollution, hazardous wastes, and noise. Industrial operations, accordingly, have the potential to affect the health of our workforces, that of our environment, and through it, the health of nearby populations, and sometimes even populations that are very far removed. For example, what are we talking about? If you look at let's look at some extreme examples. If we look at some of those incidents of nuclear explosions in one country, that's industrialization, the use of nuclear energy to power industry, etc. And you have these nuclear disasters and nuclear radioactive releases into your environment. In some cases, some examples where the explosion was pretty big, radioactive releases would have spanned countries. Wind carrying some of these pollutants across countries. All right, so that is how other populations very far can be affected as well. They were not involved in the actual incidents, but they can be affected. So let us look at some other human activities and how they affect our environment and potential health. All right, let's look at agriculture and the environmental changes associated with that. So we know that agriculture is a dominant form of land use, and it's also a dominant form of activity that consumes water resources. And food production, we know, is important for ever-growing urban populations. Point two here, we know that over two-thirds of the water that we use is for agriculture. But we also know that agriculture is responsible for a lot of water pollution, example by nitrates, phosphates, and pesticides. It is also a source of greenhouse gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide, and these contribute on a massive scale to other types of air pollution and water pollution. It is also a leading cause of loss of world's biodiversity. So agricultural activities, remember agricultural activities, whether it's for farming or rearing of cattle or other types of animals, it requires space. And associated with that, We find that landscapes will be changed, deforestation, etc. Once you get involved in that, you know you are destroying habitats, you're displacing various species, you're disrupting ecosystems, and of course you will have biodiversity loss associated with that. Next point, there are also health impacts that result such as from the agricultural activities, such as antibiotic resistance, because of a lot of the different processes involved in the agricultural development and the growing of food, chemicals and animal rearing. You find they would often use antibiotics in the animals in order to keep them from getting sick, but then it remains in the system of the animals, and then when humans consume that, it gets in our system and causes a resistance, a human resistance to the use of antibiotics. That is why we find in recent times doctors are often not too eager to prescribe antibiotics anymore because of that that antibiotic resistance. Okay. Other health consequences of the agriculture we find is increasing cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes. Um, we find reproductive and endocrine system disorders because a lot of the chemicals in the food that we eat disrupts our endocrine function, and a whole host of other health associated problems that can be linked to the food that we eat. Okay, let's look at poor waste management. So rapid population growth and urbanization, we know we've already discussed that, increases the amount of waste and the rate at which we generate waste. So where we have unregulated waste management, as often occurs in poor countries, we find increases in human health and environmental risk. So that can link back to some of the points that we've already discussed. Next point, poorly managed waste services, I beg your pardon, poorly managed waste serves as a breeding ground for vector diseases. So that's like, mosquitoes and rats and things like that. Those are all examples of vectors, and they carry diseases. These all, it contributes to that. It also contributes to global climate change through the production of the methane gas, and it also can promote urban violence. Now, one example of that issue of urban violence associated with poorly managed waste, one of the things you will find is actually happens globally in many countries where you find you have let's say like informal dumps or poorly managed landfill sites. You actually find a lot of crime associated with those locations, because you find a lot of, for example, scavengers and people who might be searching for things like maybe waste metals and things of that nature. Um, they would often fight, and sometimes you find it happens right here at home, right? We would often hear things like dead bodies showing up in the landfill site and things of that various nature, and this is something that happens globally. So that is another issue that, or another consequence that is often associated with poorly managed waste. Okay, let's go to our global patterns of resource use. Right. So due to continued growth of our global economy, so we know growth of our global economy is associated, directly associated with with industrialization. We find that the demand for natural resources continues to increase. This results in serious environmental damage through the extraction, process itself. So we have environmental damage through the extraction process itself. For example, the drilling for petroleum, oil and gas. Then we have other extraction processes that such as quarrying, and these things, there's a direct destruction of our environment when we do that. But also associated with the natural resource consumption, is the issue of transportation and how transportation contributes to the degradation of our environment. Because when the resource is extracted, transportation must be involved, not only in the extraction process, has to be transported to facilities for processing, and then also a transportation is needed to facilitate final consumption. So that means that transportation plays a big role now in consuming resources such as fuel, and we know that burning of fuel such as fossil fuel is a significant contributor to pollution of our environment, particularly our air and water environments. And then lastly, let us look at industrial accidents and their role in affecting our environmental quality. So we know that industrial accidents releases hazardous substances that continue to contribute to environmental damage, and they cause serious adverse effects, health effects among local populations. And as mentioned in the previous slide, depending on the nature and the scale of the accident, it can also affect persons in communities or even in countries further afar. If those releases are air pollutants or even water, we know it could be transported via wind patterns and water currents to far distances. People may be traumatized by these accidents. We know lives may be lost and bodily systems may be impaired. So we're talking about physical and mental trauma, loss of life, and even if you survive, what quality of life will you have? So, for example, a good example to look at would be, as I mentioned, nuclear disasters. Look for examples on the human health consequences of nuclear disasters or nuclear accidents. Point 3, pollutants may spread through the natural environment, interacting with flora and fauna. It can damage soils and water quality, so we know that. It can also increase industrial accidents, also increases in work-related diseases. It shows increases in work-related diseases. So some of these may not even be accidents, but for example, consider maybe the use of certain types of materials in workplaces. Remember, for many years, there was the use of asbestos materials in many workplaces. And we know that when exposed to that type of material for extended periods, so that length of exposure we know is also an issue. People develop many diseases associated with exposure to asbestos. All right. So that so industrial, it's not only industrial accidents, but poor management of even the systems around you, the materials, the airflow, and all of those things that are associated with health and safety in the workplace, all right, can have an impact on human health. So at this point, I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please refer to eClassroom for further instructions. Thank you.